Some things depend on us, others don't. Epicteto, every relationship, romantic, family or friendship, lives within this limit. You can offer love, but you cannot force reciprocity. You can reach out, but you can't force someone to stay. And that's where the Stoicism meets with the Christian faith, at the exact point where the control ends and to trust begins. The Stoic learns to accept what fate removes. The Christian learns to trust in the God who removes. And both discover the same truth: what leaves also teaches. The Bible says, every branch that bears fruit, he prunes so that it will bear more fruit. John 15:2. Pruning is painful, but it is a sign of care. What you call rejection, God calls redirection. What you call loss, heaven calls protection. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not over external events." In plain language, don't fight removal, fight resentment. Stoicism teaches you to see clearly. Faith teaches you to see with purpose. Together they say, accept what has been removed and preserve what is eternal. Your peace, your character, and your faith. If you asked peace, God will not sustain connections that drain you. If you asked clarity, sometimes it will come in the form of silence. So when he closes a door, don't call it punishment, call it alignment. Because the same hand that prunes also prepares. If this message already speaks to you, sign up here for Think Stoic 101. Every week, we transform pain into wisdom, faith into strength, and silence into clarity. You are not alone on this journey. Ethan found this out the hard way. Married for 8 years, he believed that love could withstand anything, including exhaustion. He struggled to keep alive a relationship that, little by little, became a minefield of silences, excuses, and small daily withdrawals. Love began to hurt more than it healed, but he didn't see, because when the heart becomes attached, reason becomes silent. Until one day she said, "I don't feel the same anymore." Ethan stood there in silence. I felt the ground opening up, but inside a voice whispered, "Maybe this is not the end, but deliverance." At that moment, he didn't believe it. It just hurt. I repeated the scenes, the words, the what-ifs that lead nowhere. But time and God began to reveal something he hadn't seen. The love that held him was also suffocating him. Marcus Aurelius said that suffering arises from resistance to what is already a fact. Ethan realized the wedding didn't end that day. It had been ending for months, perhaps years, the moment truth ceased to inhabit conversations and peace ceased to reside in the home. The pain wasn't punishment, it was clarity. What seemed like abandonment was divine protection. What sounded like rejection was redirection. God saw what Ethan couldn't, intentions, fears, subtle manipulations, and intervened, because sometimes God's love doesn't come as comfort, come as removal. And that seems unfair at first, but it is compassion disguised as loss. Stoicism teaches that acceptance is the first step to transformation. Faith teaches that trusting is the first step to healing. And together they whisper to the heart, "It wasn't you who lost. It was God who spared you." You don't have to be in a marriage to feel this. It could be a friend who has moved away, a partner who has betrayed your trust, a love that has grown cold without explanation. The pattern is the same. You tried to hold on to what was already going away, and God in love decided to release it for you. This is not punishment, it is liberation. Because sometimes the worst prison is the fear of being alone. And God, being Father, prefers to see you free and wounded than imprisoned and suffocated. As Epictetus said, freedom is the only good worth pursuing, and it comes when we stop desiring what does not depend on us. This is what divine detachment is all about, not of coldness, but of clarity. 3 simple moves for today. 1. Admit what is. Stop calling what's over a pause. The mind heals in truth, not in illusion. Do pray for alignment, not return. Say, Lord, if it is not your will, do not allow it to be my insistence. 3. Protect your inner citadel. Limit what fuels toxic longing. Messages, photos, searches. Peace requires discipline. Stoicism prepares you to endure. Faith teaches you to rise again. And life, under the eyes of God, shows you that what was taken away was never punishment, but care. So breathe. What left didn't take the best of you. It just took away what was preventing the best from being born. Don't call it a loss. Call it divine preservation. The following days were a maze. Ethan woke up to the same emptiness. That silence after the good morning that never came again. At work, he pretended to be normal. At home, he pretended to be strong. But when night fell, the silence spoke louder. The heart asked, why did God take away someone I loved so much? He tried to understand what he did wrong, where he failed. But maybe the right question wasn't, why did it end? And yes, why do I still insist on calling punishment what could be deliverance? You Stoics, they called itamor fati, love fate, not out of submission but out of wisdom. They believed that even what hurts can serve. And the Apostle Paul said the same in another language. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God. Romans 8:28. All things, even goodbye, even silence, even heartbreak. Ethan began to realize maybe God hadn't destroyed anything. Perhaps it would have only revealed what had long since been undone. He prayed for restoration, but God responded with distance. And this distance at first hurt like rejection, until he began to see that it was protection. One night he reread what he had underlined in Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. When something hurts you, remember, it's not a tragedy, it's just part of the order of the universe. And then he wrote next to it, part of God's order. And for the first time, the two ideas stopped contradicting each other. What the Stoics called fate, Ethan began to recognize as purpose. What he had previously called loss now sounded like divine pruning. But the turning point only began when he realized something simple and painful. He wasn't suffering from the absence of the person, but from the absence of control. Stoicism teaches, it is not the event that destroys you, it is the judgment you make about it. Epicteto, and faith adds, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Proverbs 3:5. The first calls you to reason, the second to surrender. Together, they heal the anxious heart that wants to understand everything. Ethan, for the first time, stopped trying to understand. Instead, he began to observe, how do I react? What is this pain teaching me? What is God shaping me to be now that everything has fallen apart? The revelation came slowly, like dawn. He realized he had spent years trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. That confused loyalty with self-sacrifice. Who believed that love was insisting when love sometimes is allowing God to end what you don't have the courage to end. And at that point, the Stoicism and faith became two sides of the same mirror. One taught the not react to chaos, the other the trust in the Creator. You weren't rejected, you were redirected. These words echoed like a divine whisper. The love that left was not punishment, it was correction. The loss was not the end, it was the beginning of alignment. Ethan's transformation began when he decided to practice 3 small but powerful Stoic Christian attitudes. 1. Accept without bitterness. Accepting is not agreeing, it is ceasing the internal war against what is already a fact. Like a soldier who lays down his sword when he realizes the battle is over. 2. Thank you, even without understanding, not as resignation but as active faith. Say, Lord, if you took it away, it's because you saw what I didn't see. Gratitude doesn't change the past, but it changes where you see it. 3. Restart the soul's routine. I would get up, make my bed, go for a walk, read a psalm and a page of Marcus Aurelius. It seemed small, but small is what rebuilds the broken. Discipline restores dignity to what chaos had taken. One morning, as the sun streamed through the window, he noticed something different. The emptiness still existed, but the pain no longer ruled. He understood that peace is not the absence of wounds, it is the presence of meaning. And there in silence he murmured, God, thank you for taking away what I wouldn't have the courage to let go of. And it was at that moment that the weight began to transform into lightness. The removal turned revelation. The pain turned discernment. And what seemed like an end became the beginning of healing. Because the truth is this, God sees what you don't see. He sees the intentions, the masks, what the smile hides. And when love blinds us, He intervenes, not to destroy, but to preserve, not to humiliate, but to liberate. And when you understand this, the heart learns something that Stoicism and faith have been trying to teach for centuries. True peace is not in who stays, but in who you become after God removes. Months passed. Time has not erased everything, but revealed what was left standing after everything fell. Ethan now lives alone. The same silence that once suffocated him is now the sound of his healing. The house is the same, but the man is not. There is less noise, less rush, and much more peace. What Stoicism called detachment, the tranquility that comes from self-control, has now become a real experience. And what faith called redemption, the good that God brings to life from what seemed like ruin, became testimony. He learned that the heart only stabilizes when it understands that God does not take away to punish, He takes away to prepare. The love that left did not diminish it. Absence only revealed that God's presence was enough. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The obstacle is the path." Ethan smiles as he rereads that sentence. The obstacle was not the divorce, it was the attachment. The attachment that kept him from seeing what God was trying to show him, that true love never asks you to die inside. One morning, reading Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is near to those who have a broken heart." Ethan noticed something subtle. God was never far away. He just waited for the noise to stop so his voice could be heard. Little by little, the heart returned to its place. But not the same place. A place firmer, more conscious, freer. He stopped praying for things to go back to the way they were. Now he prayed thus, "Lord, do not give me back what took me away from your purpose. Teach me to love without losing my peace, to care without losing myself." And this simple prayer became a way of life. Stoicism gave him the structure to not react. Faith gave him the soul to continue loving. And together they formed it into something rare today, a man at peace with what he has lost. Ethan's transformation did not come in a visible miracle. It came in a silent miracle, that of the mind ceasing to resist. He no longer needed to understand the why, just the what for. Life hadn't returned to normal. It had returned to the essentials. It was then that he realized what God removed, He also replaced. It replaced people with purpose, noise with clarity, pain with direction. What was once a hole was now space to grow. What seemed like the end became fertile ground for the new. Challenge for the next 24 hours. 1. Set aside 10 minutes of total silence. No music, no cell phone, just you and God. Ask, "Show me what the Lord is pruning." 2. Write a sentence that will be your reminder of Stoic wisdom and faith. For example, "It's not rejection, it's realignment." 3. Do something that symbolizes liberation. Delete the conversation. Throw away the object. End the cycle. Faith needs gestures, not just words. And in the end, Ethan understood what you might need to hear too. You didn't lose. You were preserved. You weren't rejected. You were redirected. You were not forgotten. You were chosen. Because God does not destroy what He loves. He refines. And sometimes the fire of pain doesn't come to burn you, but to purify you. The Stoic would call it wisdom. The Christian would call it grace. But they are both speaking from the same light, inner freedom. And when you find it, something changes forever. You stop asking people to come back and start thanking God for showing you who would actually stay. You stop looking at the past with longing and start looking at it with gratitude. And the phrase that once hurt now becomes liberating. God saw what I didn't see, and so He removed them. If this message touched you, sign up for Think Stoic 101. Here, we transform loss into purpose, silence into wisdom, and faith into real strength. You are not alone on this journey. Leave us a comment. What did God need to remove to protect you? Because remembering this is remembering that God's love doesn't always comfort. Sometimes it corrects. But every correction is a sign of care. And every end, when surrendered to Him, is